Don't speak unless you're spoken to, and for heaven's sake, Clara, try not to embarrass us. Those were the last words my mother whispered to me before we entered courtroom 4B. My father didn't even look at me. He just adjusted his silk tie, his eyes fixed on the inheritance papers that would effectively erase me from the family tree. To them, I was the clumsy daughter, the disappointment who didn't marry a senator or finish law school. They sat in the front row, radiating old money elegance, while I sat at the back, a ghost in a thrifted suit. They thought this was a funeral for my future. But as the heavy oak doors creaked open and the room fell silent, the Honorable Judge Sterling didn't go to his bench. He walked past my parents' expensive lawyers, past my brother's smug grin, and stopped right in front of me. My name is Clara Montgomery, and this is the story of how my family tried to bury me, only to realize I was the one holding the shovel. The morning air was thick with a damp Sacramento fog, but inside my parents' foyer, the atmosphere was even colder. I stood by the door, clutching the strap of my bag, while my brother Julian and our mother stood by the grand mirror, adjusting their appearances as if they were preparing for a red carpet event rather than a probate hearing. They were draped in cashmere and designer labels, symbols of a legacy they hadn't earned but felt entitled to own. Julian glanced at my scuffed shoes and let out a short, sharp huff of air, the kind of sound you make when you see a stain on an expensive rug. "You're actually wearing that?" he asked, his voice dripping with a casual cruelty he'd perfected since we were children. Before I could answer, Mother turned, her eyes narrowed in a warning. "It doesn't matter what she wears, Julian, as long as she stays in the back and keeps her mouth shut. This is a delicate matter for the Montgomery name." She stepped closer to me, the scent of her expensive perfume nearly suffocating. "Don't speak unless you're spoken to, and for heaven's sake, Clara, try not to embarrass us." The betrayal didn't start in the courtroom. It started the moment grandfather's heart stopped beating 6 months ago. Grandfather Silas was the only one who truly saw me. While my parents chased social status and Julian chased the bottom line of the family's textile empire, Silas and I spent our afternoons in his library, discussing history and the value of a person's word. He always told me, "Clara, the loudest voices in this house are often the emptiest." But the moment he was gone, the vultures descended. Within 48 hours, my father produced a will that seemed to defy everything Silas stood for. In this new document, the sprawling estate, the investment portfolios, and the ancestral home were split evenly between my parents and Julian. My name appeared only once, in a clause that granted me a modest educational stipend, on the condition that I moved out of the main house immediately. I remember sitting at the mahogany dining table, watching Julian smirk as he read the lines that essentially made me a stranger in my own home. I tried to speak up, to tell them that grandfather had promised me the library and the deeds to the coastal property, but my father slammed his hand on the table. Silas was confused at the end. "Clara," he lied, his voice like cold iron. "This is the final word. Don't make a scene and prove us right about you." They thought they'd forged a perfect cage of paper. They had no idea I was already looking for the key. What my family didn't realize was that while they were busy picking out new upholstery for grandfather's study, I was busy making myself useful elsewhere. They had stopped paying my tuition, assuming I'd come crawling back for a handout. Instead, I took a low-level job as an archival assistant at First National, the very bank that handled our family's private trusts. They saw it as another embarrassing failure, a Montgomery girl filing dusty folders for $10 an hour. But those dusty folders held secrets that silk ties couldn't hide. Late one Tuesday, deep in the climate-controlled basement, I found a misplaced ledger from grandfather's private vault. It wasn't just a record of money. It was a record of truth. Inside, I found a series of notarized letters Silas had written in his final months, documenting Julian's attempts to coerce him into signing a different will. Even more shocking was a carbon copy of the actual final testament, the one that had never been filed. Grandfather knew they would try this. He had intentionally left breadcrumbs in the bank's old-school paper filing system, knowing Julian's generation was too tech-obsessed to look at anything that wasn't on a glowing screen. I spent weeks cross-referencing dates and bank transfers, realizing my father had been skimming from Silas's medical fund for years. I didn't say a word at dinner. I didn't argue when they took my car. I just scanned every single page and sent them to a very specific office, waiting for the one day they couldn't ignore me. The courthouse was a monolithic structure of cold marble and echoing hallways, a place designed to make the individual feel small. As we walked toward courtroom 4B, the click of my mother's designer heels sounded like a countdown. The air inside smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the heavy, stifling scent of expensive anxiety. My parents and Julian moved with an effortless grace, nodding to the bailiff as if they owned the building. They took their seats in the very front row, a united front of charcoal wool and polished pearls. I, however, took a seat 3 rows back, deliberately choosing the shadows. I felt the weight of their judgment like a physical pressure. Every few minutes, Julian would glance back, his eyes scanning me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, checking to see if I was about to burst into tears or make a scene. Before you hear what happened next, I want to ask you, have you ever felt like the invisible person in your own family, the one everyone ignored until they needed a scapegoat? Comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has reached. The side door opened, and the bailiff's voice boomed. All rise. We stood as the Honorable Judge Sterling entered the room. He was a man who carried the weight of the law in his very stride, tall, with a sharp jawline and eyes that seemed to see through the veneer of every person in the room. My father leaned over to Julian and whispered something about Sterling being a reasonable man, a man who understood the importance of legacy. They were practically radiating confidence, expecting the session to begin with a quick bang of the gavel and a final signature on their forged documents. But the gavel never hit the block. Judge Sterling reached his bench, set down his spectacles, and then did something that made the air vanish from the room. He stepped down. He didn't look at the expensive legal team my father had hired, and he didn't acknowledge the polite nod Julian offered him. Instead, he began to walk. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic sound of his robes rustling. My mother's hand went to her throat, her knuckles turning white. Julian shifted in his seat, his smug grin frozen into a mask of confusion as the judge walked right past their row. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of my bench in the back. I felt the heat of my family's stares burning into my neck, a mixture of fury and bewilderment. Judge Sterling looked down at me, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a ghost. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, familiar fountain pen, one I recognized from grandfather's desk, and spoke in a voice that shook the very foundation of my family's pride. "Miss Montgomery," Judge Sterling began, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, "I believe you've been holding on to something the court was missing." He turned his gaze toward the front row, where my father had half risen from his seat, his mouth hanging open in a silent, indignant protest. The judge didn't wait for him to speak. He signaled to the clerk, who began distributing copies of the documents I had unearthed from the bank's archives. "What you see before you," the judge announced, returning to his bench, but keeping his eyes locked on my brother, "is the corrected ledger and the notarized final testament of Silas Montgomery. It appears the will previously submitted to this court was not only outdated, but a calculated fabrication." The courtroom erupted into a low murmur. Julian's face turned a sickly shade of green as he looked at the pages in his hand. It wasn't just the will, it was the surveillance of his secret meetings and the records of the money my father had skimmed from Silas's care funds. "But Judge," my father stammered, his voice cracking, "this girl, she's unstable. She's trying to embarrass us with lies." Judge Sterling slammed his gavel down, the sound like a gunshot. "The only embarrassment in this room, Mr. Montgomery, is the behavior of grown men who would rob a dying father and disparage a daughter who has shown more integrity than the rest of you combined. These documents are verified by the bank's highest authority. They include a video deposition Silas recorded just weeks before his passing, one where he explicitly states that he did not trust his sons with the family's future." The judge then looked back at me. "Silas knew you would be the only one brave enough to look for the truth, Clara. He didn't leave you a stipend. He left you the keys to everything." My mother slumped back into her chair, her old money elegance dissolving into a puddle of terrified realization. The trap I'd been setting for months had finally snapped shut, and for once, I wasn't the one being told to stay quiet.